8 Simple Rules for Loving a Vampire by Simplified Emotions. Rule number 4. Vampires are extremely possessive, are prone to mark you as theirs. Hermione had been to several meetings with the Wizengamot, which essentially meant nothing for the time being, especially when Ch.4 was pushing back so brutishly against her. Her legislation was either too weak in argument and so wouldn't get a positive reception, or it was too forceful and would push people away from it. If it wasn't her verbosity of language, it was the scarcity of it. She wanted to shove every complaint he had ever made about her work so far down his throat until he felt as sick as she did when he opened his mouth. Some members of the Wizengamot supported Hermione's legislation because they supported both creatures and non-human rights. Those who were afraid seemed to be most frightened of the power creatures and vampires would have at their disposal if they had access to wands, and Hermione found herself constantly arguing that it wasn't the power of a person, but what they did with that power that mattered. This swayed some of the Wizengamot members, but her proposal was ultimately rejected, and Hermione suspected it had to do with Ch.4's sway among the more conservative members. He gave her a derisive smirk as she walked out of the Wizengamot chamber, lifting his hand to shake hers in a mock apology. She gave him a cold smile as she returned his stony handshake, digging her nails cruelly into his palm. "Not to worry. This was great feedback for my next attempt." Ch.4's eyes flashed. "Miss Granger." She let go of his hand as if it were infectious and lifted her head up high. "I'll be looking forward to meeting with you again, Mr. Ch.4. His face pale was fury. Hermione felt more determined than ever as she walked away and back to her office, and started again. After a particularly long day spent catching up on neglected paperwork that she'd left piling, Hermione flew to the manor and was greeted by Draco at the library's doors. He looked like he had run to meet her. "Hi," she said quietly, tugging at the sleeve of his sheet awkwardly as she smiled at him. "Hi," he returned, just as stilted. They were in that awkward part of interacting with each other wherein between the moments they spent snogging, they were at loss as to what to say or how to progress in ordinary conversation. It always felt like Draco was holding back. She'd hug him and he would crush her for a moment before he stilled and loosened his hold. Hermione didn't know how to tell him that she felt a thrill in the way he would roughly grip her. Any time she thought to mention it, she felt her cheeks heat and Draco would ask her if she was feeling ill. As it was, Draco had taken to shaking her hand at the very moment she leant in for a hug. This resulted in an awkward jigsaw of hands being placed as they shouldn't be. Draco's hand landed on one of her breasts while she smashed her face on his chest. He didn't immediately jerk his hand away, making Hermione blush, and the warmth of his palm made her shiver. He cleared his throat, slipping his hand from between them, but before it could be swayed by his boring pure-blood mannerism once more, Hermione grabbed it and set it on her waist to rest. He was warm, and she pressed herself closer to him. He seemed to calm more after a few minutes of them standing together. "How was your day?" He tried in an attempt to ease away from their fumbling. "A lot of work," she said vaguely, and she noticed that he looked tired. "Are you—" "I'm fine. I just took the blood packet an hour ago," he said with a grimace. "I'm just not feeling well." Hermione furrowed her brows, and she resolved to finally offer Draco something she'd been debating for a few weeks. There was nothing to do but just say it. "I think that you should have a fresh drink. I think that you should drink my blood." Draco stared at her a moment. His mouth opened and shut, and he reminded Hermione vaguely of a goldfish. He didn't seem to understand. "I give you permission to bite me and suck my blood," she clarified, when he still said nothing. She internally winced. Goodness, could that have come out any more clinical? He seemed to come back to himself after staring at her for several seconds. "Absolutely not," he said in a cold voice. Hermione pulled back. "Why not?" Some vampires drink from people they know, and they've reported feeling much more energized and less sickly from it than with blood packets.
Granger!
He bit out her name like a curse.
I am not drinking your blood.
Hermione wilted at the way he said "your" and pinched her lips together. I see. So you still think my blood is dirty, then? His eyes widened. She turned and started to walk away. He grabbed her by the arm and hauled her back, pressing her to his chest as his hands wrapped around the back of her neck.
I don't think your blood is dirty, he said fiercely. I haven't thought that about any muggerborn for years now.
Then why? She asked. She could hear how small her voice sounded and hated it. His eyes softened.
I don't want to hurt you,
he said. You won't, she promised, palming his cheek, feeling relieved at the resolve of his statement. His jaw flexed under her hand, and he leaned into her touch. You won't turn me into a vampire unless we share blood according to my research, so you can drink it and I will be fine. Let me do this for you.
Granger,
he cursed.
I'm not a good person. What you're offering me, I can't promise it won't hurt you,
he said. He looked him straight in the eye. I trust you not to hurt me, Draco. He regarded her for a moment, but she realized he must have already lost his internal battle because his eyes darkened. He lifted her mouth to his and walked her to the wall next to the door, pressing her against the cold surface. He kissed her with a hunger she hadn't experienced before. She felt absolutely devoured in a matter of seconds, and she tried her best to catch up as a flurry of sensation coursed through her.
Don't offer something when you don't know what you're giving up,
he said, voice rough. She raised a brow. I'm me. You think I would offer something without learning everything about it first? He growled against her neck.
What?
Hermione felt her entire body heat as he undid the string of her shirt, causing one side of her shirt to slide down. Draco grazed his teeth lightly along her collarbone, and she gave a ragged gasp. She clung to his shoulder when she felt her knees giving out. Draco! He was leaving small imprints without fully biting her. She could feel his hot breath painting fire on her skin. Your room? He said, voice rough, and picked her up in one fell swoop. Draco!
No use waiting,
he said as he exited the room. He carried her up the stairs over his shoulder like she was some prize he had caught in the woods, and the thought made her clench her thighs together against his back. When they made it to his bedroom, Draco set her on top of the chest of drawers instead of the bed, and immediately ravaged her mouth, gently peeling off her shoes and moving his hands under her skirt to remove her tights. He was sucking on her pulse. He wrapped her arms around him as he moved his lips, then teeth down her slim throat.
So much skin, he said.
Hermione thought she might have stopped breathing for a moment. She lifted her hands and started to unbutton Draco's shirt. She was only halfway done before Draco picked her up again and threw her on the bed. She landed with a soft bounce and looked up at him in surprise. He immediately went to her side and cupped her face.
I'm sorry. I didn't think you'd land that far.
She put her hands on his forearm, smiling. It's all right, but what is that supposed to mean? He grimaced.
You're small, but you weigh almost nothing. So, I mean it literally when I said I didn't think you'd go that far.
Hermione's eyes widened, and she smacked Draco in the shoulder before moving away from him. He wrapped an arm around her waist and dragged her beneath him. She glared up at him.
Don't pout,
he said against her lips. Hermione avoided his mouth and brushed her own against his jaw, nibbling on the somewhat rougher skin there. She could feel his erratic pulse as she slightly skimmed her fingers down his chest to the belt of his trousers. She pulled on it to bring him forward, and he braced his palms on the mattress on either side of Hermione's head. She looked up at him, his cheeks flushed and his warm breath coasting on her cheeks as she unbuckled him. He could hear his breath as she put her hand inside his pants to touch the warm, hard length of him. His whole body trembled as his hips jerked at her touch.
"Granger,"
he warned. His hands moved, one curling covetously around her hips, while the other ghosted her cheek. His slim fingers made burning shapes with a sparkling precision on her face as he caressed her jaw, his thumb sliding against her cheekbone and the point above her brow. Hermione was sure her countenance matched his. Dark eyes, panting breath, shaking heart. She trembled at the growl he emitted when she started making tight circles with her fist. She felt powerful. She wanted to unravel the cold placidity with which his expression always greeted her. He looked transfixed as she pumped. Draco grabbed Hermione's wrist to stop her movements. "No?" she asked.
"I'm going to come,"
he said, looking pained. She smiled. "Isn't that the point?" He laughed.
"Only you could have both the tone of voice to make that sound tempting and as if you're speaking to a subject in a research facility."
"I am adept at many things." She grabbed his neck and pulled him down to kiss him, and he released her wrist to tangle it in her hair as he kissed her back.
"That you are,"
he said breathlessly against her mouth. Hermione continued stroking him, adjusting for speed and tightness in her fist by the way Draco's breathing changed and the way his own hand fisted almost painfully in her curls. She would kill him if he made a knot that she would have to brush out. A breathless groan left him as he dropped his head to her neck.
"Hermione,"
he whimpered. She inhaled sharply at the pleading tone of his voice and rubbed her thighs together to quell the ache building between them. Her body writhing underneath him caused Draco to press himself closer to her, and Hermione felt her hands going slack with the intensity of desire she had. His panting breath spurred her on, and she started stroking faster, while her other hand tried its best to curl around his broad shoulders. A few more strokes, and he came, breathing harshly into her neck, and his arm rubbed possessively around her waist as he surrendered to the aftershock. He whispered against her neck, and she realized he'd cast a cleaning spell on both of them. Hermione looked up at him as she caught the scent in the air. "Mint."
"I'd say that I have a lot of free time. I'll teach it to you later," he said.
God, she wanted to jump his bones, and he seemed to sense her impatience because he pinned her down and kissed her. Oh, this wasn't a kiss. This was devouring. His mouth, his fingers, his very body were making a very compelling effort to melt Hermione into the bed. She wondered dazedly what kind of imprint she would make when she was no longer solid. Draco spoke and brought her back out from her head. "What?"
"Please, let me touch you. Let me bite you,"
he pleaded. Okay," she stammered. Her cheeks flushed when she remembered her earlier proclamation. Draco's brows furrowed.
"Are you absolutely sure we don't have to?"
he said. She met his eyes and said clearly, "I'm just nervous. I want it." He nodded and kissed her forehead.
"Let's make you less nervous, then."
He took Hermione's hand and raised him above her head, where he crossed her wrists and, using his other hand, rendered feather-soft caresses across her body, tracing her like she was a person in a painting.
"Don't move,"
he said. Her shirt at some point had been undone, and her breasts were all but spilling out of her bra. Draco kissed down her chest as he unzipped her skirt and pulled it down with her knickers while Hermione watched. He pulled his shirt off, and Hermione took the opportunity to unclasp her bra when he stopped her.
"Keep it on,"
he said thickly. Hermione made a note in the back of her mind to wear a green bra if this were to happen ever again. It turned out that torturing Draco was a new hobby she liked actively participating in. He circled the point of her breasts until her nipples pebbled, and she squirmed under him, before taking one and then the other in his mouth. Something about the fact that her bra was still on felt more sensual than if she were completely naked. Hermione whined when he sucked on top of her breasts. At the same time, he dragged his thumb unbearably slow across her nipple.
"You're so sensitive,"
he said tightly, as he grabbed her hands, that she hadn't even realized had moved to his head, pulling him closer. He kissed down her body, kissing each side of Hermione's ribs and taking extra care around a long purple scar on one side. She smiled. "I got that scar from Dollarhof when I was 16. You don't have to be gentle," she said. Draco looked up at her, his hungry gaze making way for something else, something burning.
"Yes, I do,"
he said, his expression fierce and rooting her to the spot. Before she could respond, Draco was placing soft, wet kisses up her thighs, nibbling on a particularly sensitive spot on the inside of her knee that made Hermione kick his shoulders instinctively. He smirked.
"I'll remember that,"
he said as he brought her legs over his shoulder. "Brett! Oh, Draco!" she gasped. She could feel his hot breath on the most sensitive part of her, causing her legs to tremble in anticipation. Hermione very unattractively thought of herself as a hot air balloon being heated by a fire-breathing dragon before she flew far, far away into the sky. She didn't know how she could. She hadn't. No one, not that Ron or the other men she'd been with, hadn't tried, but she was never able to feel anything when they tried, opting to tell them she was ready without any of the before parts.
"Come back to me, Granger,"
Draco said. "I can't," she said, burying her face in her hands. "It's not that I'm embarrassed about you being—" She gestured between them.
"Between your thighs?"
he said. She huffed, feeling her cheeks heat. "I just find it hard to get out of my head when I'm not in control." He suddenly circled her core with his deft tongue, making her gasp as her suddenly boneless body toppled back onto the bed.
"I will endeavour to make you leave that glorious head of yours,"
he rasped. "You're very humble," she said, panting as he stepped and flicked. Hermione's back bowed, hips lifting off the bed as she refrained from screaming his name. Draco placed a hand on top of her stomach, pinning her down, as he licked and sucked while she rested her hands on his forearms. "Draco, please!" She didn't know what she was saying please for. Stop? More? Both, somehow, and all at once. But there wasn't one single word she could think of to articulate that, so she settled on please, please, please. He seemed to know what he was doing, though, and Hermione almost shrieked as he slid one and then two fingers inside of her. She clamped her thighs around his head, unable to take the mounting pressure building inside of her. Draco wrapped his hand around one thigh and opened her up to him again, and Hermione bit into her elbow to keep from screaming.
"I want to hear you, Hermione."
"Oh, God!" she whined, and he tortured her more as he curled his fingers, flicking his tongue over where she ached most. She looked down to see him staring up at her, his cheeks flushed as if he were enjoying this as much as she was, drowning as he devoured her. He sucked in a rhythm that was both gentle and ruinous, and Hermione came with a shriek, closing her legs around Draco's head as her entire body spasmed, whispering no more as he placed a few more kisses to her sensitive core. She felt tremors coursing through her entire body as Draco lifted her to sit astride his lap, and she was vaguely aware of him, moving her curls to the side and baring her neck to him. He palmed her throat with his hand and held it, bringing it forward and looking at her intently as she stared back at him in a daze.
"This will hurt at first,"
he whispered. She nodded dazedly, still trembling from her orgasm. He kissed her neck a few times, moving his hand to the side of it as he opened his mouth wide. She saw the glint of his fangs in the moonlight before he sunk them into the delicate flesh of her neck. Ow! Oh, it hurt. It hurt so much. Hermione instinctively tried to push him away, but Draco's firm grip on both her neck and waist kept her from escaping. "Draco, she gasped. There was a new sensation coursing through her along with the searing pain. She felt her entire body heat as Draco withdrew his fangs and started sucking her neck. His fangs dug into her soft flesh, the sharp sensation making her breath hitch and her body tighten until the sensation turned delightful. Her nerves were on fire in the best way as he took more blood from her. She was in delirium, so alive with pleasure, in an unexpected wave of emotion that she almost missed Draco moving his hand up her thigh. "I'm sensitive," she whined, sensing his intent. She tilted her hips away from him, but he held her close with his arm around her waist, like he was holding her to him.
"You can give me one more, can't you, Hermione?"
he said. His voice was rough and dry, and yes, she absolutely could give him one more if he would continue sounding like that. She nodded, and he gently parted her legs, and he inserted those long fingers once more, pumping them until she was a writhing mess, clinging to his neck with both arms as he sucked and caressed and pumped, and Hermione came with a louder wail than before.
"Gods!"
Draco rasped, tightening his hold on her. She looked at him. There was blood around his mouth and chin, in his eyes. He was as dazed as she was. His eyes were silver-bathed in fire around the edges, being swallowed by the dilation of his pupils. It was like being drawn into a captivating black hole that greeted you in the darkness. She was starting to feel dizzy the more he sucked, and she curled her fingers on his chest as he started to feel a little sleepy. Draco gently extricated his mouth from her neck and laid her down, summoning what looked like a blood-replenishing potion and tipping it to her mouth.
"Drink this. I'll be right back,"
he said after she had downed it. He vanished the vial, disappearing into the bathroom and returning with a wet cloth as Hermione lay languidly. She felt completely sated and could fall asleep right there. Her eyelashes fluttered open as Draco wiped the blood off her neck and cast another cleaning charm on her, then removed her bra gently and set the covers over her. He slipped in, and Hermione immediately shifted over and buried her face in his chest. He had a woody and smoky scent to his skin, like burnt sandalwood. "What do you know about hot air balloons?" Hermione asked tiredly. He felt her eyelids drooping. Draco wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close.
"Those muggle contraptions that fly in the air? What about them?"
he asked. Hermione laughed, curling into his chest, and promptly fell asleep. Hermione was warm. There was a furnace on her back, and she idly wondered when Crooks had grown so large. She would need to put him on a diet. She opened her eyes. Oh, right. There was no Kneasel, but there was a vampire-sized Draco Malfoy currently behind her. His long limbs were encasing her in an inescapable cocoon. He briefly wondered if she should panic at the possessiveness with which he held her before she shifted even closer to him. Hermione felt cherished in his arm. She lifted a hand to her neck and thumped the area where the two small indentations of teeth, fangs, were still on her skin. The bite mark was a little raised, and she could feel some small bruising around the area, but overall it didn't hurt. She wondered how a bite would feel in the more fleshy parts of her body and barely refrained from rubbing her bare thighs together. The action must have awoken Draco because previously the relaxed position around her suddenly stilled. She turned to look up at him. He looked at her worriedly. He cast his eyes down to where her neck was in plain view and tentatively brushed a thumb across the bite mark, causing Hermione to shiver.
"Are you okay?"
She raised her hand and palmed his cheek. "I'm fine, more than fine. Last night was wonderful for me." She blushed at the way his eyes darkened.
"I didn't hurt you."
"It hurt at first, but it was fine after the initial sting. I don't want to stir your ego, but it was very pleasurable for me," she said. He smirked. She rolled her eyes, but before she could turn away and get out of bed, he pulled her tight to his chest and curled himself around her. "How was it for you?"
"Indescribable in the best way," he said. "I feel like I haven't had this much energy in years."
Hermione smiled, pleased. She looked at the sun rising outside. "It's daylight."
"Do you have to work on Saturday?"
he asked. "No, but I should."
"Perfect,"
he replied. He stretched his long limbs and then reached for her, one hand making residence in her curls as the other wrapped around her waist. She supposed she could sleep for a while longer. Hermione learned that the neck was not the only place a vampire could sink their fangs into. Of course she knew that vampires could bite other places, but having an intimate understanding of how each area being bitten could elicit a different sensation was an entirely new area of research. One which she, for once, was perfectly fine with not recording for others to read. She could only imagine the title. Prim and Proper Hermione Granger, A Descent into the Arms of Draco Malfoy. Narrated by Draco himself, who teased Hermione as he made a study of her body like she was a map that needed exploring. Chapter 1. The Insides of Her Thighs. Reactions: sharp gasps, incoherent moans, and loss of memory of the English language. Draco had told her that he wanted to try her biting thighs because they had more meat to bite into, and Hermione was intrigued by the idea. What she was not so intrigued, but very much flustered by, was that Draco thought he should try at a moment that was in Hermione's mind inopportune. He wrapped a warm hand around Hermione's bare thigh while she was on the stepladder reaching for a patient text for him. Cunning fucking Slytherin. He turned her around gently, hand sliding tantalizingly up, 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 as Hermione stared down at him. She was only wearing his white button-up shirt and the pair of extra knickers she'd brought in her bag. One really couldn't be too careful. The shirt was long and reached around the middle of her thighs. "You can't be serious," she muttered, wanting to hide in her embarrassment. "I quite like you being above me, Granger." "Oh God, it's Draco." Hermione put her hands over her face as she felt her cheeks color crimson. She didn't think she had blushed this much in years. He laughed, and it was a dark, mischievous sound that vibrated in her chest like a sound wave that reverberated through an empty room. Hermione felt her thighs trembling as he parted them slightly. "Your skin is so soft. It seems a shame to mark it," he said. "I like the marks," she admitted. He looked up at her, and she could have sworn she heard a growl before he lifted her off the ladder and walked over to place her on the couch. He kissed and nipped the sensitive skin of her hips before traveling to her stomach and down, down, down. He parted her thighs and placed wet kisses on them. She was squirming and ran her fingers in Draco's hair before taking hold of it and moving him where she wanted him. He took her hand out of his hair and kissed her knuckles before taking both of Hermione's hand and gripping them. "Draco!" she huffed. Kept leaving nibbling bites all around her thighs, enough to bruise her. She squirmed. "Patience," he commanded, placing a warm hand on her stomach to still her. She jerked against him when he blew on her core. I can't." She was stalled from any further speech when Draco found a spot he liked, and he bit into her pale flesh without warning. She gasped, the prickle of pain making her whine before white-hot pleasure encumbered all of her other senses. Draco set her knickers to the side, inserting his determined fingers into her core, thumb flicking and pressing against her biggest pressure point to contrast with the stinging pleasure of his fangs, and she came with a hoarse scream against him as he sucked on her shaking thighs. Chapter 2. Wrists. Reactions: sensitive. Draco joking about Hermione's wrists being strong from writing so much she hit him, and receiving gentle kisses on them in apology was one of the most affectionate things she had ever experienced. Hermione found out that she had particularly sensitive wrists. Draco taught her this in a long lesson one afternoon when they were lounging in bed, sated and clean after a bath. Draco could do the most damnable things with his dexterous fingers. Trailed up and down each wrist barely a whisper of a touch, and he would stop at the inside of her forearm and rub soothing circles without touching any other part of her. And this alighted sparks of desire within her, and she would pull him down to kiss her. A person's wrist was one of the most vulnerable parts of their body. The thin skin, the pulse which rose as Draco traced it. Trusted him with that vulnerability, the heart on her sleeve. When he switched to her left arm, he stared at the crude lettering his aunt had gifted her, and looking at her knot, he touched it. "I'm so sorry, Hermione," he said, his voice sounding broken and desperate as he traced the scar gently. "You didn't do this to me, Draco." "I know, I'm sorry for all of it." She nodded, grabbing hold of his chin so he met her eyes. "I've already forgiven you," she said, looking clearly into his eyes so he would know she was telling the truth. His eyes were conflicted, and he tried wrenching himself out of her grasp, but she held tighter. "You don't get to decide whether or not I forgive you. That belongs to me. I forgive you, Draco. It's only you that has to forgive yourself." He nodded, but he still looked dismayed. She reached for his arm and caressed his own mark. Tried pulling away, but she only brought him closer, insistent. "We can't keep holding onto the past if it has no presence in our present. You don't think of me that way. You did when you were younger, right?" He shook his head. "Oh, of course not." She smiled at him, kissing the rare skin of the skull. "Then leave your guilt in the same place you left those thoughts." Draco looked at her for one moment before nodding hesitantly and pulling her forward to kiss her tentatively. She immediately deepened the kiss, melting in his arms and wrapping herself around him. He indulged her a few minutes before pulling away and pushing her back down on the bed. She ached to have him touch her, and he seemed to realize this, the smug bastard, because he gave her a full grin, fangs and all, before he kissed down her right arm, laving the thin skin of her wrists and giving it a reverent kiss before moving up and down the left arm. When he came back to her scar, he kissed it gently, making Hermione's heart pound painfully in her chest. He then moved up her arm again, a touch of his lips that made Hermione squirm. She stared up at him with pursed lips, breathing heavily, even though he hadn't even done anything, but he looked at her with such an affectionate expression that she got lost in his silvery gaze. He also looked hungry, like he wanted to eat her, and it was only when she clenched her thighs around his waist so hard that he groaned against her that he finally sunk his teeth into her wrists. He looked at her the entire time as blood trickled down his chin and onto her arm. It was the most erotic sight she had ever seen. Draco Malfoy starved for her as he sucked on her flesh. Another time, which Hermione still blushed at whenever she thought of it, Draco sucked on one wrist while he took her other hand and told her to touch herself. She was apprehensive, and so he took her hand, guiding her fingers where he usually puts his, and they worked in a tandem that had Hermione gasping and moaning against his shoulder. She left nibs of her own skin on his bare chest, causing him to moan above her as she sucked and laved at his skin. She wanted to devour him too. That particular experience made them both light-headed, and they passed out from exertion on the couch for the rest of the day. There was also a chapter of Hermione's own observation. It came when they were reading together, Hermione sitting on Draco's lap. Draco made an offhand comment about she supposed they were in a relationship. She wasn't quite sure what she could define them as. "You'll get over this at some point," he said as he stroked her hair while she was thinking through a runic pattern. She looked up at him questioningly. "Your fascination with me, or at least what I am," he explained. Hermione raised a brow. "What? Is dating a vampire a phase? I'm not sorry to say that the main fascination I constantly have with you is when I don't feel compelled to slap you at least 10 times a day, although it is a marked drop from when we were at school." He snorted. "Granger." But he didn't get to finish because Hermione shut him up by kissing him, moving to straddle him and wrapping her arms around his neck, the book still held precariously in her hand. "Fuck, Granger. Watch out for the fangs," he said as she ravaged his mouth. Picked her up and deposited her on the desk as she cooed and soothed the sharp points of his teeth. Draco whimpered and buried his face in her hair. "They're sensitive," she teased. His breath was on her neck, and Hermione clenched her thighs around his hips as they shook at the feeling of his warm body pressed to hers. Hermione was by no means a passive lover, and she pushed Draco off and made him sit on the desk. He then climbed into his lap once more while they argued about the finer points of sunlight and adequate vitamin D. Hermione was losing the argument and thought distraction was her best solution. He stiffened for a moment before relaxing, his hand spanning her back and under his black jumper that she'd stolen when she'd gotten out of bed that morning. "Hello." Lips twitched in a smirk. "Is this the way you distract all of your friends when you're wrong?" She smiled, wrapping her hands around his neck and leaning in. "Are we friends?" she said against his lips. He hummed. It wasn't an answer, but she could feel the quickening of his breath as she grazed her teeth against his jaw before traveling to the sensitive point under his ear. She moved to his mouth and kissed him lightly, cajolingly, because she loved spurring the fire within him. She wanted him to burn her. He deepened the kiss, wrapping his arms around her and pulling her close. She could feel Draco's fingers twitch against the small of her back and tilted her head up to look at him. "You can let your claws out." He stiffened.
"I don't want to hurt you."
"Some scratches are hardly injuries," Hermione reasoned. She took his withdrawing hands and placed them on her hips. He nodded but seemed hesitant to do anything more than massage soothing circles on her hip bones. Physical intent accompanied better results than words, Hermione decided. She raked her sharp nails, biting them to the quick when anxious, made them delightfully scratchy, down Draco's bare chest, and his hips backed against hers, jostling her. She leaned below his ear, nipping him as she whispered, "I have claws too, if you'd prefer parity." He groaned.
"You're killing me."
"Rather difficult for the undead, I think." She arched into his chest as sharp claws replaced nails as Draco dug into her skin, and she keened in pleasure.
"Bossy witch,"
he said, and then he kissed her.
"You."
She kissed him again to shut him up. To be continued. Thank you for listening to this chapter of 8 Simple Rules for Loving a Vampire by Simplified Emotions. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, or AO3.